This speech is cheerleading for the Chinese Communist Party. You praise the Belt and Road Initiative. You praise their entrapping developing countries in debt bondage. And you say the United States should follow China's model. Is it the role of America's UN ambassador to be cheering on the Chinese Communist Party at the expense of the developing world and at the expense of America?
Senator, it was not my intention, nor do I think that I cheered on the Chinese Communist Party. What I recommended in that speech is that Africans need to open their eyes on how they deal with the Chinese. And I would like to see the United States government do more in Africa to compete with the
My final question, did you have even a word of criticism about the Chinese Communist Party, about its murders, about its tortures, about its concentration camps, about its genocide? Did you have even a word of criticism in the speech you gave at the Confucius Institute?
I spoke about human rights there. That's the speech, but you don't see my other engagements with students who ask questions that I answered frankly. And I don't ignore human rights. I talk about the fact that Africans like our values.
But in the speech, did you address human rights?
I did. Human rights is referred to as something that we promote in the United States.
What did you say about human rights in the speech?
That are our values.
What did you say?
I mean, in my discussions with Africans.
But
I
speech
appreciate
didn't have
what
any.
you're saying. I'm not denying this. As I said, I regret this. This is one speech in my 35-year career, and I do regret that speech, but if you look at what I have done prior to that, there is no question that I understand. I am not at all naive about what the Chinese are doing, and I have called them out on a regular basis, including today.
Thank you.
There is a very specific kind of silence that falls over a United States Senate confirmation hearing when a trap is about to be sprung. It is not a peaceful silence, but the heavy, pressurized quiet that precedes a political earthquake. On this particular morning, the bright lights of the committee room illuminated a scene that would soon become a masterclass in political confrontation. Sitting in the witness chair was Linda Thomas Greenfield, a veteran diplomat nominated by the Biden administration to serve as the United States ambassador to the United Nations. This is not just another bureaucratic desk job. The UN ambassador is the literal face of American values on the global stage, staring down hostile foreign adversaries every single day. Across the room sat Senator Ted Cruz, his demeanor calm, methodical, and profoundly dangerous to anyone hiding a secret. He was not there to ask polite softball questions about diplomatic theory. He had come armed with a stack of papers, a very specific timeline, and a burning question about the single greatest geopolitical threat facing the United States. That threat, as Cruz firmly laid out, was the Chinese Communist Party. For years, the intelligence community and lawmakers from both sides of the aisle had been sounding the alarm about Beijing's malign influence operations. This was not a partisan talking point, but a matter of urgent national security. Did you know that foreign governments routinely use academic institutions to infiltrate American communities? One of the most insidious tools in the CCP's arsenal has been the Confucius Institutes. Funded directly by the Chinese Communist government, these centers were marketed as cultural exchange programs. In reality, they were Trojan horses. Congress had already documented repeated, undeniable problems of espionage and aggressive state-sponsored propaganda originating from these very institutes. The threat was so severe that Cruz himself had authored bipartisan legislation to crack down on them, passing Congress with overwhelming support. At the exact same time, the United States government was actively fighting to dismantle this foreign spy network. A prominent American diplomat made a very different choice. That morning, a bombshell report from the Washington Post dropped right onto the desks of the committee members. It detailed a speech given just a little over a year earlier, in October 2019. The speaker was Linda Thomas Greenfield. The venue was a Confucius Institute. The sponsor was ultimately the Chinese Communist Party. How does a seasoned diplomat, someone tasked with defending America from authoritarian regimes, end up giving a paid speech at a known propaganda hub? This was the curiosity gap that Senator Cruz was about to pry wide open. The camera zoomed in, capturing every micro-expression as the interrogation began. Cruz leaned forward, his voice remarkably steady, presenting the sheer cognitive dissonance of the situation. He demanded to know how she could reconcile the American government's desperate fight against CCP espionage with her own decision to accept their platform. The nominee knew she was in dangerous territory and immediately attempted to reframe the narrative. Thomas Greenfield explained that she had gone to Savannah State University, a historically black college with which she had a long-term relationship. She claimed her goal was simply to engage with students, talk about careers in the Foreign Service, and discuss U.S.-China policy toward Africa. She wanted to make it sound like a routine, innocent academic speaking engagement. Then, she dropped a detail that immediately shifted the energy in the room. She admitted to receiving a $1,500 honorarium for the appearance. Money had changed hands. Suddenly, this was no longer just a lapse in judgment regarding venue selection. This was a paid engagement linked to an organization funded by a hostile foreign power. Thomas Greenfield quickly tried to build a firewall of defense, stating she was actually appalled by what she saw the Confucius Institute doing in poor black communities in Georgia. She claimed their predatory behavior in America mirrored the aggressive tactics she had witnessed them using across the African continent. She looked the committee in the eye and expressed strong regret for having given that particular speech. If she had to do it all over again, she insisted, she would have flatly declined the invitation. To bolster her defense, she leaned heavily on her resume. She reminded the committee of her 35-year career working across the globe. She pointed out that back in 2005, she had aggressively raised concerns about the Chinese sending North Korean defectors back to certain death. She stated unequivocally that Chinese malign efforts undermine the prosperity of developing nations and threaten American security. It sounded like a solid, patriotic defense from a seasoned professional. But Ted Cruz is not a man who drops an investigation just because a witness offers a polished apology. He had listened patiently to her defense, tracking every word and every evasion. He noted her newfound horror at the Confucius Institute's actions. Then, he delivered the first devastating blow of the hearing. "You've said you were horrified by seeing firsthand what the Confucius Institute was doing," Cruz stated, his eyes locked on the nominee. "Did you keep the money?" The simplicity of the question was staggering. It cut entirely through the diplomatic jargon and the 35 years of foreign service experience. It was a brutal, binary question about ethics and accountability. The nominee hesitated, her previously smooth delivery suddenly fracturing. "I can tell you what I did with the money," she stammered, attempting to pivot the conversation toward her charitable habits. She claims she gives a tremendous amount of her meager resources to humanitarian efforts. But a pivot is not an answer, and Cruz was not about to let her escape the trap. He immediately interrupted her evasion with a cold, hard fact. "And so you did keep the money, though. You didn't give it back." Trapped in the glaring lights of the committee room, Thomas Greenfield finally surrendered the truth. "I did. I did not give it back," she admitted. She weakly attempted to argue that the check came from Savannah State University, not directly from the Confucius Institute, but the damage was already done. The money was only the first phase of the confrontation. Cruz was now ready to deploy his ultimate weapon. While the nominee had spent the last 5 minutes claiming she was a staunch critic of China's abusive practices, Cruz reached for the physical document resting on his desk. He held up a sheaf of papers. It was the exact transcript of the speech she had delivered to the Confucius Institute. In politics, there is nothing more terrifying than your own unedited words coming back to haunt you. "Perhaps you have spoken out elsewhere," Cruz said, his voice dropping to a register of absolute disbelief. but I can tell you I am holding the speech you gave at the Confucius Institute, and I can't find a single word of criticism in this speech." The silence in the room deepened. The transcript was not a balanced academic critique of foreign policy. According to the senator reading directly from the pages, it was something much worse. "This speech is cheerleading for the Chinese Communist Party," Cruz declared, driving the final nail into the nominee's defense. He pointed out that she had actively praised the Belt and Road Initiative. This is the very same predatory program that entraps developing countries in massive debt bondage. Even worse, the transcript revealed that she had suggested the United States should actually follow China's model. Cruz looked directly at the nominee, his face a mask of incredulity. He asked a question that resonated far beyond the walls of the Senate chamber. Is it the role of America's UN ambassador to be cheering on the Chinese Communist Party at the expense of the developing world and at the expense of America? The trap had closed completely. Thomas Greenfield, clearly rattled, insisted it was never her intention to cheerlead for a communist regime. She argued that her real message was that Africans needed to open their eyes to how they deal with the Chinese, and that the U.S. needed to compete more aggressively. But Cruz was not done reviewing the document. He had one final devastating metric to apply to her speech. He asked if there was even a single word of criticism regarding the CCP's horrific human rights record. Did she mention the murders? Did she mention the tortures? Did she bring up the concentration camps or the ongoing genocide? The nominee weakly replied that she had spoken about human rights in general terms. She claims she discussed human rights as something the United States promotes globally. But when pressed for specific criticisms of the regime paying for the event, her answers evaporated into the sterile air of the hearing room. Cruz hammered the point home. She had gone to a propaganda center funded by a murderous regime, taken a speaking fee, and failed to utter a single specific critique of their atrocities. In fact, she had praised their global economic traps. The paper in his hand was undeniable proof of a catastrophic diplomatic failure. With her defense utterly dismantled by the written evidence, Thomas Greenfield had nowhere left to turn. She stopped fighting the premise of the interrogation. "I am not denying this," she finally confessed, her voice reflecting the profound weight of the moment. "As I said, I regret this. This is one speech in my 35-year career, and I do regret that speech." She pleaded with the committee to look at her entire history rather than this single glaring compromise. She insisted she was not naive about what the Chinese were doing, claiming she was calling them out regularly. But the visual of the hearing remained burned into the public consciousness. A seasoned diplomat had been completely exposed by a single document and a relentless line of questioning. This confrontation highlights the invisible battles fought every day in Washington. It is a stark reminder that foreign influence does not always arrive with an invading army. Sometimes it arrives with an invitation, an honorarium, and a polite request to look the other way. The hearing concluded, but the questions it raised will echo for years. Can a nation effectively combat an adversary if its top representatives have previously accepted their money and praised their tactics? Ted Cruz made sure that question would never be ignored again.